Tonight on Primetime Politics, David Johnston's rough ride.
I will continue to invite disagreement on my recommendations, but will not be deterred from completing my work.
The special rapporteur appears before the Procedures Committee. 3 hours of cross-examination. But what was learned about foreign interference? We will speak with former CSIS officer Michel Juneau-Katsuya. Also,
were you telling Canadians the truth on May the 23rd or back in 2016?
what to make of the questions being asked of the former Governor General. We'll speak with 3 political observers. And
Conservatives are creating an enormous amount of mischief with incredibly juvenile tactics.
with the spring sitting nearing its end, what are the government's priorities and what will they have to do to move ahead with its agenda? We will speak with Liberal House Leader Mark Holland. This is Primetime Politics. Hello, everyone. I'm Michael Serapio. The Special Rapporteur on Foreign Interference found himself in the hot seat today. David Johnston, facing 3 hours of questioning from the Procedures and House Committee, asked about his recommendation against a public inquiry and his relationship with the Prime Minister and the Trudeau family. All the while, Mr. Johnston trying to keep the focus on what he believes is the bigger issue, protecting Canadian democracy.
I would encourage the members of the committee to read the report that we have prepared and focus our attention on the real danger we have here, which is clear, present, pervasive foreign interference in our elections. In our report, we've tried to avoid the discussions of partisan kind that you referred to follow the facts, apply the law thoroughly, thoughtfully. And I would urge us to get on with this important matter of foreign interference that does require immediate attention by this body and the institutions of Parliament to protect our national security and protect our citizens.
With his take on the Special Rapporteur's appearance, we're now joined by Michel Juneau-Katsuya, former intelligence officer and manager with CSIS. Michel, good to see you again.
Always a pleasure. Thank you.
Listen, I want to begin with your experience here, because as one who has worked in and with Canada's intelligence community, what did you make of Mr. Johnston's appearance today?
Fortunately, I think I will have to side with the opposition when it comes to the impartiality of Mr. Johnston. Despite the phenomenal career that he's led before, today the response that we are receiving from him is basically sort of a repetition of what Mr. Trudeau have been trying to say for a long period of time, which is to push the blame everywhere else, but accept to take the responsibilities of what the government has or has not done in order to deal with foreign interference.
Okay, well, let's pick up on that, because, you know, when you listen to the opposition, part of their issue has to do with Mr. Johnston's conclusion, which essentially said that based on what he saw, there is no evidence that the Trudeau government failed to act on foreign interference concerns. At the same time, he's not sharing the information, and in fact, he points the blame essentially on what he calls a communication failure with the intelligence community. What do you make of that?
That's where I really get off the train at that point, because for the last 30 years, I've been part of the intelligence community, and I know that we have been bringing the warning and the information all the way up to every prime minister since Mr. Mulroney. In every cases, we've seen all the prime ministers either ignoring, either failing to take action, or simply by using the information to their own device or to their own need. So in that perspective, I'm not in agreement at all with Mr. Johnston in that perspective. I think Mr. Trudeau has, just like his predecessor, failed to take action when it was time to take action.
Now, of course, part of the problem here, too, is the fact that Johnston's conclusions here are based on evidence, intelligence evidence, that he's not sharing. He's not actually connecting a path for parliamentarians to understand why he's actually come to this conclusion. What do you make of that? Because we are dealing with top secret intelligence here.
It is top secret intelligence, but the intelligence is very, very important, and CSIS would not sit on that information without passing it and relaying it to the Prime Minister or somebody in its immediate entourage. And it is so easy also to accuse an organization that will not take the microphone and will not go and defend themselves or say the opposite. At this point, unfortunately, I think it's a wash. And this is an extremely disappointing perspective that I'm seeing here from Mr. Johnston. Like I said, I can only honor the career that he has before. But when it comes now to try to resolve this situation, a phenomenal crisis, shall I repeat, that Canada is going through, I'm not seeing it as part of the solution. I'm seeing it as part of the problem.
Okay, now part of the remedy of this could be a public inquiry. We've heard that time and again from opposition MPs, but Mr. Johnston says that a public inquiry cannot be had because you're dealing with such sensitive information. What do you make of that assessment then? Do you think a public inquiry is, one, necessary and two, possible?
Well, at the beginning, I wasn't in favor necessarily of a public inquiry for some of the good reason that Mr. Johnston has mentioned, that a good amount of the information will be classified and will not be able to be shared with the general public for the right operational reason. Unfortunately, the more the government has been dragging and the more Mr. Johnston has been dragged into sort of playing this role that it seems that is convenient to the government, the more now the public inquiry seems unavoidable because the public is losing trust in our institutions. The public is losing trust in our leadership, and our allies are losing trust in our ability to resolve this situation. We went from bad to worse to terrible management as we speak.
Michel, thank you for this. Appreciate the time.
Always a pleasure. Thank you very much.
That's Michel Juneau-Katsuya.
The approach that the opposition parties, particularly the Conservatives, have taken in terms of personal attacks, in terms of smearing smearing David Johnston and his team, are absolutely irresponsible and unserious. The issue of foreign interference is one that needs to be taken seriously, and falling into baseless partisan attacks isn't worthy of the work that we need to do together as parliamentarians.
Well, that was the Prime Minister from earlier this morning, once again making arguments for the former Governor General, now Special Rapporteur. But those repeated defenses did not stop opposition MPs from asking tough questions of David Johnston, taking issues with his conclusion that no public inquiry is needed and with Mr. Johnston's relationship with the Trudeau family.
Now, Mr. Johnston, what we have before this committee are two completely different descriptions of your relationship with Justin Trudeau. Those two different descriptions cannot be accurate at the same time. So my question is simple and direct, Mr. Johnston. Were you telling Canadians the truth on May the 23rd or back in 2016?
Madam Chair, telling the truth with connection with my relationship with Prime Minister Trudeau goes back to when our children were teenagers, and during the course of almost 40 years, we had no meetings, no dinners at one another's homes, no particular contact. Was a friend of the father, etc., but those were the extent of the contacts.
Well, for their reaction to Mr. Johnston's appearance and the questions being asked, we're now joined by three political observers. Carlene Variyan is Associate Vice President at Summa Strategies, Garry Keller, Vice President at Strategy Corps, and James Valcke, Director of Research and Strategy at Viewpoints. Nice to see all three of you.
Good to be here.
Hi, Michael.
Listen, I want to begin here with a quick go-around because I'm wondering what you made of the questions being asked, really, of Mr. Johnston, both the substance and the tone of them. Did it tell you anything about what the members of that committee were trying to achieve? Carlene, I'll get you to start.
I mean, I think the fact that you had party leaders show up to committee kind of bumping their designated caucus representative, which they typically don't, demonstrated that at least to a certain extent, the opposition party saw this really as an opportunity to further fuel media coverage of the story rather than a time for serious inquiry. I also was interested that among the first questions for David Johnston were not about his work investigating foreign interference, but whether he may or may not have had supper with Justin Trudeau when he was a child once. I think that tells you about how seriously the Conservatives are taking this committee when it comes to actually getting down to finding ways to learn more about foreign interference or what we can do to stop it. So those were my broad takeaways.
Yeah, Garry, what was your takeaway from them?
Yeah, I thought there was two sets of questions or two sort of themes through the meeting. The first one was really focused around Mr. Johnston's past relationship and his relationship with the Trudeau Foundation and the Trudeau family. And it's no surprise the Conservatives led off on that because that has been part of their reasoning why Mr. Johnston should recuse himself from this. And it really goes to less about his integrity and more about his judgment in some of the appointments he had. On the other hand, there were some really substantive questions, I think, from all parties about the content of the report and, frankly, some of the inconsistencies that what was in Mr. Johnston's report and what was later testified, specifically by Mr. O'Toole, to the point where even Mr. Johnston had to acknowledge that, well, maybe he didn't have the full story in his report. And I actually think that a number of members of Parliament did a fairly deep job at kind of blowing a hole into some of what Mr. Johnston had said, even to the point where a Ontarian from the Bloc Québécois made a very good point that he hadn't even bothered to talk to either the Commissioner of Canada Elections or the Chief Electoral Officer about something as specific as elections. So I think there were two sets of two themes to the questions there, and I think it was very interesting to hear some of the testimony today.
Okay, James, what was your takeaway from that?
Yeah, I agree with Garry on a lot of the points. There were some substantive questions which I think got to the bottom of some of the issues that Mr. Johnston may have been not focusing on as much as some of the parties would want. But then there were some personal things too, and there was certainly some people trying to rack up points at the start of the committee meeting, at least. I think the Conservatives came out like with the nuance of a brick thrown at a window. They were a bit overly aggressive, but they were very direct in what their messaging was, and they were keen to highlight some of the things they saw as conflicts of interest. For the Liberals' part, I do think that they, kind of dragged the puck a little bit here and there. But one of the things they also tried to do is, the Liberals and Conservatives turned into that Spider-Man meme where they all end up pointing at each other, trying to say, well, back in 2008, Stephen Harper said this about David Johnston, and the current leader, Pierre Poilievre, said this about David Johnston, as if they were trying to catch each other in a trap. But when the objective questions got out there, I do think the content was enough to raise some flags with ordinary observers of this committee, questioning whether or not David Johnston has the full scope of the issue in hand.
Yeah, well, that raises an interesting point, James, because, as you point out here, there are these questions being asked of Mr. Johnston. He wants Canadians to focus on the bigger issue of how to stop foreign interference, but can he legitimately do that if there are still lingering questions about whether or not he gave the Prime Minister and the government a free pass on their response to interference in the last two elections, and whether or not there are, these lingering questions as well about perhaps details that the opposition wants to know more about. Garry, I'll get you to start that one.
I think, I'll leave it to the words of former Ethics Commissioner Mary Dawson, who in the Globe and Mail this morning, her quote was, "What a mess." And even though she said there may not be a legal conflict of interest, there is an appearance of conflict of interest, and that makes this job for Mr. Johnston very, very difficult. And I think this is the problem that has been bedeviling Mr. Johnston along. This is essentially dealing with elections, and elections are often driven by, as we know, political interests. And somebody who is not a political actor seems to be surprised that there are political questions being asked about his ties to the Liberal Party. I think even more damaging to Mr. Johnston's work is less so the relationship he may or may not have had with Mr. Trudeau. The Trudeau Foundation itself, I think, is problematic. But his chief legal counsel, Sheila Block, not only was a multi-$1,000 donor to the Liberal Party, she attended a specific fundraiser 2 years ago with the Prime Minister, a Liberal Party fundraiser with the Prime Minister. That certainly increases the risk that there's appearance of a conflict of interest. And Mr. Johnson's reply was, well, she hasn't been in any rooms. Well, it was a Zoom call, so I guess they were in a Zoom room together. But still, I think these are problematic questions that the opposition parties have a right to question. And Michael Chong, I think, said it best when he said, our job is to hold the government accountable, and we can't seem to get answers to this. And your role isn't actually, making it easier to do that because of these perceived conflicts.
Yeah, Carlene, what do you say to that? Because again, the question here is, can David Johnston legitimately do his investigation if there are still lingering questions about him and the details around his conclusion?
There's no question that David Johnston's job has been made more difficult and will continue to be a challenging one as he kicks off further hearings this summer. But what we need to ask ourselves is why it's being made more difficult. And I think a large part of it is that political parties have decided to make a partisan issue out of this investigation into foreign interference. The reality is, when he was first appointed as special rapporteur, every single party was consulted on that appointment before it was made. As we've talked about before on the program, there's a relatively small, quite a small group of Canadians who were probably on the short list for being able to serve in a role like this. Generally speaking, I think that those who were involved in the decision would have likely thought that a Governor General appointed by Conservative Prime Minister Stephen Harper, who had served under both Liberal and Conservative administrations, would likely be an acceptable pick, especially considering, past roles that he's played, like in the Airbus inquiry, with Brian Mulroney and things like that. But right from the get-go, what we saw from the opposition parties, I'd say particularly from the Conservatives, was a determination to repeatedly and incessantly attack his credibility. So unfortunately, from a certain perspective, I think the die was cast from the start, and his work was always going to be made difficult by these kinds of attacks. And it's unfortunate because the people who bear the consequences of that at the end of the day are really Canadians.
James, what do you say to that?
Yeah, no, I understand the point of view. I think that if we're talking about some of this, like the questions that were asked of David Johnston at committee, Jagmeet Singh was there to question him, and he asked him, a lot of members of the diaspora community don't feel safe or secure going to a public forum and expressing what they feel through fear of intimidation. How will you fix that? And Mr. Johnston's response was actually not quite good. And that's too bad because he needs to be able to respond to those things. I think that what we have here is a difference between perception and reality. In what they say in politics, perception is reality. And right now we have a question out there that's actively going on and, is being reinforced daily with new news stories. It's not just the political parties. There are new news stories coming out daily that question whether or not David Johnston has the impartiality to fulfill this mandate. And I would say this is new if it was, but it's not. Even during the Mulroney-Schreiber affair, when David Johnston came out with recommendations about how the public inquiry and the scope of the public inquiry, one of the things he didn't recommend is the motivation, whether or not there was a kickback scheme in that cash envelopes full of cash that were changed hands. And at the time, the opposition Liberals called that a whitewashing. I think the problem is right now we are in a perception and reality thing, and I think the perception is growing that there is a conflict of interest, and some of the actions that are being taken are reinforcing that, and I think that's a hard problem for the government to get out of.
Okay, so, and I have to say, this has to be a quick one because I only have about a couple of minutes left here. What does it mean for his work then? Here we are just a couple of weeks before the end of this spring sitting. Parliamentarians will be heading back to their constituencies. They won't be keeping this issue alive every day here in Ottawa. So what does that mean for his hearings? Does that make it easier for him? Does it still rob him of any type of legitimacy, even if he files something, if there are questions whether or not he should be the man doing this? Carlene, I'll begin with you.
The more that we can pull politics out of the equation as he conducts this work, the better off I think our democracy will be, and then the higher the quality of the work that I think he'll be able to do will be. So the fact that this work will continue through the summer, without the partisanship and the exchanges that we see in the House of Commons every day, I think certainly can't hurt the process.
Gary?
Yeah, it's a good question. I actually think that would it be surprising if Prime Minister Trudeau came along at the end of this session and said, well, in order to let Mr. Johnston do his work in a non-partisan and balanced fashion, we're going to need to prorogue Parliament. That would prevent any other parliamentary committees from doing its work. The rumors of prorogation have been going around Parliament Hill now, so that wouldn't surprise me at all if that happened. But I also want to note, both from Mr. Singh's testimony and some other testimony from Mr. Chong as well, the reluctance of diaspora groups to participate in public hearings could actually hamstring Mr. Johnston's work because of those diaspora communities' fear of being targeted by outside influence, including Chinese influence.
Okay, James, last word to you.
I'll be quick. I mean, that vote in the House of Commons happened. You can't erase it. And he is going to be dragging that like an anchor behind him for as long as he does these committee hearings. I do think that there are some problems that might be remedied once the House rises. But until then, this thing's just going to keep boiling.
Okay, well, we will speak again. But for now, thank you for this, Carlene, Gary, James. Really appreciate the time today.
Great to be with you.
Thanks, Michael.
Members of Parliament have a few late nights in their near future. With the spring sitting coming to a close, the Trudeau Liberals still want to get a number of bills passed, and opposition tactics is delaying the government's agenda. To talk about what is happening, we're now joined by the government House Leader, Mark Holland. Mr. Holland, nice to see you again.
Thanks for having me.
Listen, we have about 3 weeks left to get a number of bills passed. Why does this happen all the time? Why does the government always seem to face a crunch at this time of year?
Well, it's frustrating. When I had many conversations with the Conservatives, asking them how many speakers they had for different bills, telling them that we had limited time, and when they drag things out throughout the rest of the year and refuse to give us information, effectively making us navigate the parliamentary calendar with a blindfold on, what happens at the end is all of that obstruction and delay and refusal to tell us how much time they need means that we're very pressed at the end. And so as a result, we're sitting every night to midnight. They've also now taken the additional step, even though they only represent about a third of the House of Commons. They're trying to block every other party from working by faking that their voting doesn't work, by pulling out other juvenile tactics like pretending to have points of order that aren't real points of order or points of privilege. So it's frustrating, particularly when the things we're dealing with are so consequential. The budget, the environment, childcare is frustrating.
Okay. I hear your argument there, but are you trying to move too many bills through without proper review? Because Conservatives do admit they're using tactics right now to highlight what they call, and this is their quote, the dangers of your high spending, high inflation, high crime agenda. Are you trying to ram in too much without proper scrutiny?
Well, let's just take a look at some of the things they're opposing. One of the things they're opposing is a price on pollution, and they're making it a condition of stopping their obstruction, even though they themselves ran on putting a price on pollution. So they actually, every single member of Parliament in the House ran on putting a price on pollution.
Under a different leader, though.
Well, still, that's how they were elected. I mean, I don't know. Certainly from my perspective, when I run in an election and I make a commitment, it would be a little bit bizarre then to turn around and to not only break the promise, but refuse to support legislation that would keep the promise that I had made. But notwithstanding that, the budget is very, very clear. It provides support, things like the grocery rebate, which actually isn't in the Budget Implementation Act. We're able to deal with that earlier. But other things that are really critically important, like making sure that we have support for students, making sure that we have support for transitioning to the green economy, making sure that we have support for dental care. These are things that are broadly supported. These are things that we've been talking about and being debating a very long time. And what I would ask is just look at the speeches the Conservatives are making in the House. They're the exact same speech. They're not offering any new ideas. They're just saying they're opposed. So they're blocking every other party from moving forward when their only thing they're offering is really the same speech again and again and again. If you give us the same speech 36 times or 100 times, it doesn't change the content of what we're dealing with.
Okay, now you did get a time allocation for the budget bill, and just this afternoon you moved for time allocation regarding C-35, the Child Care Act. Is that something we're going to see more of in these final weeks, essentially limiting the time given to any one issue?
Well, I think the problem is we saw on Friday we lost an entire day of business. The Conservatives pretended they had technical problems. They did not. They actually got into the House and told House officers that they were having technical issues when no such problems existed for any other party. It was very self-evident. It was just to sink a day of work. And then they get up on false points of privilege and try to waste a day and block every other party from doing work. So they leave us very little choice. Really what they're saying is, and Mr. Poilievre, the leader of the official opposition, has said this, that they're going to use every tactic they can to block us from moving forward. Well, that is not democracy. There are 3 other recognized parties in the House of Commons. All of them are trying to do the work of the country, and having one party block every other party from doing the business of the country makes no sense, particularly when they're offering no solutions. It's not like they're offering amendments to these bills. It's not like they're saying they want to make changes. They're just saying they oppose them, and they keep giving speeches that are frankly the same speeches over and over again. So it doesn't leave us with a lot of choice. I'm reticent to use it. I'm frustrated because in so many instances I've been asking for how many speakers they have, how much time they need, and they've obfuscated, they've refused to give that information, so they are the authors of this circumstance.
Is there any way you could give anything to the Conservative opposition to perhaps get things moving along? Because I'm wondering about the relationship between you and really Mr. Scheer at this point to try to get Parliament working, because from a Canadian point of view, outside of the political realm, this seems just like a lot of nonsense.
Well, I totally agree. It is a lot of nonsense, and I have said to Mr. Scheer on numerous occasions, let's stop this. There's many off-ramps. We're willing to work collaboratively if they would tell us how many speakers they have, if they would give us an honest accounting of what their issues are. But if they're just going to be against something, then frankly, we could give them 100 days, 200 days. We could give them 1,000 years, and they're not going to change their position. So, you know, we have to have an honest conversation about what's in front of us. And I have to say that in many other instances, working with Mr. Scheer, he has been reasonable. This has been a disappointing turn of events since Friday, and the leader of the official opposition's declaration that he's going to hijack Parliament and sabotage its processes and misuse procedure to try to block Parliament from doing its work. I hope they step back from that. We're ready to work, and we're ready to cooperate.
Okay. Well, I'd give you another 1,000 seconds, but my director and producer would get really upset with me. But so for now, Mark Holland, thank you for this.
Thanks so much.
A quick look now at the stories making headlines today, starting with David Johnston, the special rapporteur on foreign interference, saying he is moving ahead despite the House of Commons calling for his removal.
The issue of foreign interference deserves serious and robust debate. I will continue to invite disagreement on my recommendations, but will not be deterred from completing my work.
That's Johnston from earlier today telling the Procedure Committee allegations about his integrity and independence are false, and he plans to start his public hearings next month.
This is a no-brainer, and the Prime Minister can do it. He's got to stop passing the buck and pretending he can't do it. Do the responsible thing and put this monster back in a maximum security prison where he belongs.
The Conservative leader, Pierre Poilievre, is demanding an order to keep Paul Bernardo and other mass murderers in maximum security for their entire sentences. Correctional officials are taking a second look at Bernardo's transfer to a medium security institution. Public Safety Minister Marco Mendicino says he cannot reverse the decision, but is open to looking at changes once that review is done.
Mr. Poilievre, the leader of the official opposition, has said this, that they're going to use every tactic they can to block us from moving forward. Well, that is not democracy.
That's what we heard from the government House leader on moving the Liberal agenda through Parliament. The House of Commons is sitting late all week as we near the summer break. Conservatives have pledged delay tactics to block the budget implementation bill, though MPs did pass a motion today limiting debate on Bill C-47.
I also want to highlight that Minister Blair has kept the opposition leaders apprised. There was another briefing for opposition leaders last night. Everyone is completely aligned and working together on trying to keep Canadians safe across the country.
The Prime Minister on wildfires this morning, while outside, smoke was blanketing Parliament Hill. There are wildfires burning near the National Capital Region, and across the country there are still over 400 wildfires, more than half remain out of control. And finally, we are watching tomorrow for the Bank of Canada's next decision on interest rates. The bank has kept its target at 4.5% since January. That is after 7 rate hikes last year. With the economy stronger than expected so far in 2023, experts say another rate hike is possible tomorrow or in July. And of course, we'll have full coverage of that rate decision for you right here on Primetime Politics tomorrow. But for now, I'm Michael Serapio. For everyone here, thank you for watching. We'll see you again soon. But stay with CPAC. Up next, Esther Bégin avec l'essentiel.